Abandoned by her family while pregnant, she gave birth alone in the frozen wilderness, until a mysterious Viking warrior appeared and changed her destiny forever. What happened next, no one expected. In the harsh lands of northern Norway, where winter shows no mercy and the wind whispers stories of pain, lived a young woman who never imagined her life would change in the most unexpected way. Freya, Bjornsdottir, was barely 19 years old when her world collapsed like a sandcastle under a storm. With her large dark eyes, fair skin, and delicate hands, she had grown up in one of the most respected families in the village of Ravensheim, where her father, Jarl Bjorn the Iron-Fisted, owned extensive lands and timber trade routes. Jarl Bjorn was a man of iron character, with a gray beard and severe gaze, who had built his fortune with an iron fist. For him, family honor was more valuable than gold, and each of his children had to behave according to the strict rules of Norse society. Freya had been educated to be the perfect wife of some rich landowner, to unite fortunes and perpetuate the Bjornsdottir name with dignity. But fate had other plans for her. The tragedy began when Freya fell desperately in love with Eric, a young thrall who worked in the nearby iron mines. He was handsome, with an easy smile and working hands, but to Jarl Bjorn, he was nothing more than a slave without name or fortune. When he discovered his daughter's secret romance, his fury was like a volcano erupting. The walls of the longhouse trembled with his shouts, but the worst was yet to come. 3 months after Jarl Bjorn had strictly forbidden the relationship, Freya discovered she was pregnant. Her belly had barely begun to round, but fear consumed her day and night. She knew her father would never forgive such dishonor to the family. For weeks she tried to hide it, wearing looser dresses and avoiding the inquisitive looks of her mother and brothers. But truth has a way of coming to light, like water finding cracks in the most solid rock. The morning that changed everything was a Tuesday in November, when the first frosts of winter were beginning to arrive in the north. Freya was in the courtyard washing clothes when dizziness made her stagger. Lady Astrid, her mother, ran to help her, and when she held her, she immediately noticed the changes in her daughter's body. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. With eyes full of horror and disappointment, Lady Astrid took Freya directly to Jarl Bjorn's hall. What followed was a scene that Freya would remember until her last day. Jarl Bjorn rose slowly from his carved chair, his face transforming into a mask of contained fury. His fists closed on the wooden table as he processed the information his wife had just whispered in his ear. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold it seemed to come from Niflheim itself. "Is what your mother tells me true?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Freya lowered her head, unable to lie anymore. "Answer me when I speak to you!" roared Jarl Bjorn, striking the table with such force that the mead horn spilled over the maps. "Yes, father," Freya murmured with a broken voice. "I am carrying a child." The silence that followed was like the calm before the most devastating storm. Jarl Bjorn walked around his daughter like a predator stalking its prey, each step resonating on the stone floor like hammer blows on a coffin. His breathing was heavy, controlled, as if he were fighting his own internal demons. "Whose?" he finally asked, though he also knew that answer. "Eric's," Freya confessed, and in pronouncing that name she felt as if she were signing her own death sentence. Jarl Bjorn's reaction was immediate and brutal. His hand rose and the blow resonated throughout the room, leaving Freya's cheek burning and her eyes full of tears she refused to shed. But physical pain was nothing compared to the words that came after. "You are no longer my daughter," he declared with a coldness that froze the blood. "You have stained the honor of this family in a way that can never be washed away. You have chosen to behave like a whore, so like a whore you will be treated." Lady Astrid tried to intercede, but her husband's gaze silenced her immediately. Thorvald, Freya's older brother, had appeared at the door, attracted by the shouts, and upon learning of the situation his face filled with shame and contempt toward his younger sister. "Eric is no longer here," Jarl Bjorn continued with cruel satisfaction. "I had him executed at dawn for daring to touch a lady of this family. His body is rotting somewhere in the wilderness where the wolves can find it." The words fell on Freya like stones, crushing what remained of her heart. The man she loved, the father of her child, had been murdered by order of her own father. The world began to spin around her and she felt she would faint. But Jarl Bjorn had not finished with his punishment. "You have 1 hour to gather what you can carry and get out of my house," he ordered without an ounce of compassion. "If I see you near this property or this village again, I will make you pay the same way he paid. You are not welcome anywhere the Bjornsdottir name has influence." Freya looked up at her mother, seeking even a crumb of support or understanding. But Lady Astrid had turned away, tears running silently down her cheeks. It was clear that although her mother's heart was breaking, she would not dare defy her husband's decision. Jarl Bjorn's power was absolute in that house, and everyone feared him too much to oppose him. "But, father," Freya whispered with a broken voice, "where will I go? How will I survive with a baby on the way?" "That is not my problem," he replied with a hardness that seemed impossible in a father toward his own daughter. "You should have thought of that before spreading your legs for that damned thrall. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind and send you to join your lover in hell." With her heart shattered and legs trembling, Freya climbed to her room to gather her few belongings. Her hands shook as she put some clothes in a cloth sack, along with the few pieces of jewelry she had and the money she had secretly saved. Everything she had known, everything she had loved, was vanishing like smoke in the wind. When she descended the stairs for the last time, carrying her sack and with a belly that barely began to show the first signs of life, she encountered the cold gazes of her family. Thorvald watched her with a mixture of pity and disgust, while Lady Astrid cried silently from the window of the hall. Jarl Bjorn waited for her at the main door, implacable as a statue of stone. "If you ever had any love for me," Freya begged one last time, "please don't do this to me. I am your daughter. I carry your blood in my veins." "My daughter died this morning," he responded without flinching. "What I see before me is a stranger who bears a name she no longer deserves." Without more words, Jarl Bjorn closed the longhouse door with a sharp blow that resonated like the end of a chapter of her life. Freya stood on the porch with the northern wind whipping her dress and the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone in the world. She walked the dirt path that led away from the estate, each step heavier than the last. Behind her remained everything she had known: her bed, her books, her childhood dolls, the gardens where she had played as a child, the kitchen where she had learned to bake bread alongside the servants. But above all remained the unmarked grave of Eric, the man she had loved with all her soul and who now rested somewhere in the wilderness, victim of her father's cruelty. The village church was her next stop, hoping that Father Olaf could offer her refuge or at least some advice. But when she told him her situation, the priest looked at her with the same contempt she had seen in her family's eyes. To him, a pregnant and unmarried woman was a sinner who had chosen her own destiny, and the church could not be seen helping someone who had so flagrantly violated God's laws. Without shelter and without hope, Freya began to walk the trails that disappeared into the immensity of the Norwegian wilderness. Her feet, accustomed to walking on the marble floors of the family estate, soon filled with blisters inside her delicate leather shoes. The midday cold was merciless, and thirst began to torment her after barely a few hours of travel. Her wool dress, which that morning had been pristine and elegant, was now stained with mud and snow. The wilderness is a place that does not forgive inexperience or desperation. Freya had no knowledge whatsoever about how to survive in that frozen vastness, where every plant was covered in ice and every shadow held danger. She had grown up protected within the walls of the estate, where servants brought her warm mead when she was thirsty and hot food 3 times a day. Now, with each step she took, she ventured deeper into a world she did not know, and that seemed determined to devour her. During the first day, she walked without a fixed direction, stopping only when exhaustion forced her to seek the scarce shelter of some snow-covered rocks. Her lips cracked under the merciless cold, and her cheeks, once soft and rosy, burned until they took on a painful reddish color. The water she had carried in a small leather flask ran out before sunset, and the reality of her situation began to hit her with all its harshness. The first night in the wilderness was a hell of cold and terror. When the sun set behind the distant mountains, the temperature dropped dramatically, and Freya found herself shivering under her thin cloak. The sounds of the winter night terrified her: the distant howl of wolves, the threatening whisper of wind among the rocks, and strange noises she could not identify, but that her imagination transformed into mortal dangers. She huddled against a large rock, hugging her belly that barely began to show the life growing inside, and cried until she had no more tears left. The second day was even worse than the first. Without water, and with her stomach completely empty, Freya began to feel the first symptoms of hypothermia and dehydration. Her vision became blurry at times, and her legs trembled with each step. Several times she was about to collapse, but the determination to protect her unborn baby kept her moving. She knew that if she gave up there, both she and her child would die under the merciless cold. During the hottest hours of midday, which were still freezing, when the weak winter sun tried to warm the air, Freya began to have hallucinations. She saw warm longhouses where there was only snow. She heard Eric's voice calling her from the distance, and more than once she believed she saw her mother running toward her with outstretched arms. But each mirage vanished when she tried to approach, leaving her more desperate and confused than before. It was on the third day when the pains began. At first, she thought it was just hunger and dehydration, but she soon realized something else was happening. Contractions came irregularly, like waves of pain that doubled her over and left her breathless. Her body, weakened by days without food or adequate water, had decided it was time to expel the life it carried inside. Panic seized her when she understood she was going to give birth in the middle of nowhere, without help, without medicines, without even clean water to wash the baby. She desperately sought some shelter and found a rock formation that offered a sliver of protection from the wind. With trembling hands, she spread her cloak on the snowy ground and prepared to face alone the most crucial moment of her life. The hours that followed were a mixture of indescribable physical pain and pure terror. Freya bit her own clothes to avoid screaming, aware that her shrieks could attract wild animals or bandits. Between contractions, she prayed to all the gods she knew, both Christian and the Old Norse gods, begging that both she and her baby would survive this nightmare. The weak winter sun continued its course in the sky, marking the passage of time that seemed to have stopped in the personal hell she was living. When she finally felt the baby was about to be born, Freya gathered the few forces she had left and pushed with a determination she didn't know she possessed. The pain was so intense that at times she lost consciousness, but the life fighting to exit her body kept her anchored to reality. With bloodied and trembling hands, she received her son in her arms. The baby was small, smaller than he should be, but he was alive. His weak but constant cry was the most beautiful music Freya had ever heard. With tears of relief and joy mixed with pain, she wrapped him in the cleanest scraps of her torn dress. He was a beautiful boy, with bronzed skin and dark eyes that already showed the mixture of bloods running through his veins. But the joy of the moment was quickly overshadowed by the harsh reality of her situation. Freya had no milk to feed her newborn son. Her body, weakened by days of starvation and dehydration, simply could not produce the food the baby desperately needed. She cradled him against her chest, feeling how the small lips instinctively sought the maternal breast, but there was nothing to offer him except love and desperation. It was in that moment of absolute vulnerability, when Freya believed that both she and her son were going to die in that frozen solitude, that she saw him for the first time. At first, she thought it was another hallucination, a product of her delirious state. A figure mounted on horseback stood out against the distant horizon, motionless like a dark statue against the orange sky of sunset. The figure did not move. It only watched. Freya blinked several times, trying to focus her blurred vision, convinced that when she opened her eyes the apparition would have disappeared like all the previous mirages. But the rider remained there, real and solid, as if evaluating the scene before him. His horse, a magnificent dark-colored animal, remained perfectly still, as if it too were part of some supernatural vision. For long minutes, observer and observed measured each other in silence. Freya hugged her baby tighter, not knowing if this apparition represented salvation or a new threat. In her state of extreme weakness, she had no strength to flee or defend herself, so she simply waited, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest. Slowly, as if not wanting to frighten her more than she already was, the rider began to approach. He was a tall and strong man, with skin bronzed by years under the northern sun and black hair that fell to his shoulders. He wore clothes of tanned leather and carried ornaments that Freya immediately recognized as typical of the old Viking clans, the warriors who still lived by the ancient ways in the remote mountains. He was a true Viking, one of those warriors she had heard terrible stories about all her life. But there was something in his movements that slightly calmed her. He did not approach with the aggression of a predator, but with the caution of someone who had found something unexpected and didn't know exactly what to do with it. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, but not threatened. It was as if he could see directly into her soul and was evaluating what he found there. When he was a few meters away, the man dismounted from his horse with feline grace. He was even more imposing standing, with muscles defined by years of hard life and scars that spoke of survived battles. But what most impressed Freya was the depth of his eyes. They were not the eyes of a soulless savage as she had been taught to believe, but the eyes of someone who had seen much suffering and had developed a wisdom that transcended words. Without saying a word, the Viking crouched at a certain distance from her, close enough to help if necessary, but far enough not to invade her personal space. His movements were deliberate and calm, as if he were accustomed to dealing with wounded and frightened creatures. Freya watched him with a mixture of fear and fascination, wondering if this encounter would be her salvation or her perdition. The man observed the baby in her arms, and something in his expression changed. A shadow of pain crossed his face, so quick that Freya almost believed she had imagined it. But there was something in that look that made her understand that this warrior intimately knew the pain of loss, and that the scene before him had touched something deep in his soul, hardened by war. Slowly, without sudden movements that could frighten her, the Viking took from his saddlebags a leather canteen and placed it on the frozen ground between them. Then he added a piece of dried meat and some winter berries that Freya didn't recognize but were obviously edible. It was a silent offering, a gesture of basic humanity that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Freya looked into his eyes, trying to decipher his intentions. What she saw there surprised her. There was no malice or threat, only a quiet compassion and a silent determination to help. Without taking her eyes off him, she extended a trembling hand toward the canteen. The fresh water that touched her cracked lips was like a miracle, and tears of gratitude ran down her cheeks as she drank in small sips, conscious that she had to make this blessing last. The Viking watched in silence as she drank and ate small pieces of the dried meat. He made no movement to approach or touch her. He simply remained there like a silent guardian, protecting a mother and her child in their most vulnerable moment. It was as if he instinctively understood that what this woman needed was not words or explanations, but simply the certainty that she was no longer completely alone in the world. When the baby began to cry from hunger, the Viking frowned with evident concern. It was clear he recognized the signs of a newborn not receiving the nutrition he needed. He stood and walked to his horse, returning with a small leather bag. From it, he took a fine powder that he mixed with water in a small hollowed gourd, creating a thick paste that he offered to Freya with gestures indicating it was for the baby. Freya hesitated only for a moment before accepting the mixture. Her maternal instinct told her to trust this stranger who had appeared in her moment of greatest need. With infinite care, using her clean finger, she began to give small amounts of the paste to the baby. To her relief and joy, the child accepted it and began to suck with more vigor, finally receiving the sustenance his small body desperately needed. While feeding her son, Freya observed the Viking, who had become her silent savior. There were so many questions she wanted to ask him, so many things she needed to know, but exhaustion and weakness kept her in an almost delirious state. The only thing she knew with certainty was that this man, this supposed enemy of her people, had shown more compassion toward her in 1 hour than her own family in an entire lifetime. The sun began to set, painting the snowy landscape with golden and red tones that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. The Viking pointed toward a nearby rock formation and then toward Freya, making gestures that clearly indicated he knew a better place to spend the night. It was a silent invitation to trust him enough to allow him to take her to a safer shelter. Freya looked into his eyes once more, searching for any sign of deceit or malice. What she saw convinced her. This man would not harm her or her baby. There was something in his behavior, in the gentleness of his gestures, and in the infinite patience with which he had handled the entire situation, that told her she could trust him. With a small nod, which was the first genuine expression of hope she had felt in days, she agreed. The Viking, whose name she still didn't know but had already begun to think of as her guardian angel of the wilderness, helped her to her feet with infinite delicacy. When he saw she could barely stand upright, he carried her in his arms as if she were a feather while she held her baby against her chest. His strength was impressive, but the way he held her was so careful that Freya felt safer than she had felt in weeks. As he carried her toward the shelter he had promised, Freya closed her eyes, and for the first time since being expelled from her home, she allowed herself to relax completely. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if this man was truly the salvation he seemed to be. But in that moment, held in the arms of a stranger who had shown more kindness than any acquaintance, she felt as if maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The shelter the Viking had found was a natural cave protected by enormous rocks that formed a kind of natural amphitheater. Inside, the air was warmer, and there was a small spring that flowed from the rocks, creating a perfect oasis in the middle of the merciless wilderness. Freya couldn't believe such a place existed, hidden like a secret that only those who knew the wilderness could find. He gently deposited her on an improvised bed of furs and blankets that he had obviously prepared. It was evident this place was not chance for him, but a refuge he knew well and had used before. The cave walls were decorated with ancient paintings telling stories of hunts and rituals, silent testimonies of generations that had found refuge in this same place. During the first days in the cave, the Viking, whose name she learned was Ragnar, cared for Freya and her baby with a dedication that left her speechless. Every morning he disappeared before dawn and returned with fresh food, freshly hunted rabbits, winter berries, nutritious roots, and medicinal herbs that he prepared in healing teas. His movements were always silent and efficient, as if he were a spirit of the wilderness that materialized everything she needed. Freya watched, fascinated, as Ragnar prepared meals with skills she had never seen. He knew every plant of the wilderness, knew exactly which parts were edible and which could be poisonous. His hands, weathered and strong, worked with surprising delicacy when preparing the special pastes for the baby, mixing ground seeds with spring water until creating a nutritious paste that the child accepted eagerly. Communication between them was mainly through gestures and looks. Ragnar spoke very little Norwegian, and Freya knew not a word of the Old Norse tongue, but gradually they developed their own language made of signs, smiles, and expressions. It was during the 5th night in the cave when the crisis came. The baby, who had been feeding well on the pastes Ragnar prepared, began to show signs of fever. His small body heated alarmingly and began to cry with a weak but anguished sound that broke Freya's heart. She didn't know what to do. Her experience with babies was limited, and panic began to take hold of her as she held her son burning with fever. Ragnar immediately noticed the change in the baby's condition. His expression became serious and concentrated as he examined the child with expert hands, touching his forehead, observing his eyes, listening to his breathing. It was evident he had seen this condition before and knew exactly what to do. Without wasting time, he left the cave and returned with an armful of plants Freya didn't recognize. What followed was an impressive demonstration of ancestral medicinal knowledge. Ragnar boiled the herbs in spring water, creating an infusion that filled the cave with a sweet and medicinal aroma. With infinite patience, he began to give small drops of the tea to the baby while applying warm compresses of the same herbs on his chest and forehead. His movements were sure and precise, as if he had performed this ritual hundreds of times. Throughout the night, Ragnar did not sleep a single moment. He remained beside the baby, monitoring his breathing, applying new compresses when necessary, and giving him small doses of the herbal remedy every hour. Freya watched him with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, seeing how this wilderness warrior transformed into a gentle healer, fighting for her son's life as if he were his own. Toward dawn, the fever finally broke. The baby stopped crying and his breathing became calmer and more regular. Freya cried with relief as she held her son, who now slept peacefully in her arms. When she looked at Ragnar to thank him, she saw silent tears running down the warrior's cheeks. It was the first time she had seen him show emotion so openly, and that vulnerability moved her deeply. "Thank you," Freya murmured in Norwegian, though she knew he probably didn't understand the words. But Ragnar looked into her eyes and nodded, perfectly understanding the feeling behind the words. In that moment, something changed between them. They were no longer simply a desperate woman and her savior, but two people who had shared the fear of losing something precious and the joy of saving it together. During the days that followed, as the baby recovered completely, the language barrier began to slowly crumble. Ragnar began pointing to objects and saying their names in Old Norse, while Freya did the same in Norwegian. Water, vatn, thu, fire, elder, baby barn. Each new word was like building a bridge between their different worlds. One afternoon, while Freya fed the baby, now completely recovered, she gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside her for days. She pointed to Ragnar, and then to herself, making gestures that clearly asked why he had helped her, why a Viking warrior had decided to save a Norwegian woman and her child. Ragnar looked at her for a long moment before responding. With slow and deliberate gestures, he drew in the sand the symbol of a woman and a small child. Then he erased them, passing his hand over them as if they had disappeared. His eyes filled with pain as he repeated the gesture, and Freya understood immediately. He had lost his own wife and child. "Norwegian soldiers?" Freya asked in a low voice, though she already knew the answer. Ragnar nodded gravely, and in his eyes she could see the same devastating loss she had felt when her father told her Eric had been executed. Both had lost the people they loved most because of the violence and hatred between their peoples. In that moment of mutual understanding, Freya made a decision that would change everything. She lifted her baby and walked slowly toward Ragnar. "Harold," she said clearly, pointing to her son. "His name is Harold." It was the first time she had shared her son's name with anyone, and in doing so, she was offering a piece of her heart to this man who had saved their lives. Ragnar received this trust with the solemnity it deserved. He extended his hands and gently touched the baby's forehead, murmuring something in Old Norse that sounded like a blessing or a promise of protection. "Ragnar," he then said, pointing to himself. It was the first time he had told her his name, and the sound of his voice saying those two syllables made something awaken in Freya's heart. That night, while Harold slept peacefully between them, Freya and Ragnar sat by the small fire he had lit at the cave entrance. For the first time since they met, they tried to have a real conversation, mixing the few words they shared with gestures and drawings in the sand. Ragnar told her, with the patience of someone who understands language barriers, about his life before finding her, about his clan, about the mountains where he had grown up, about the sacred rituals of his people. Freya, in turn, told him about the estate where she had lived, about her family that had rejected her, about her lost love for Eric. As they spoke, Freya realized she was seeing Ragnar in a completely new way. He was no longer just the silent savior who had appeared in her most desperate moment. He was a man with his own story of pain and loss, with his own destroyed dreams and renewed hopes. He was someone who, like her, had been wounded by life but had found the strength to continue and help others. When the fire began to die down and the stars shone with all their intensity in the winter sky, Freya felt something she had not experienced since before becoming pregnant: peace. For the first time in months, she felt truly safe and protected, not just physically, but emotionally. She had found in Ragnar not just a protector, but a kindred soul who understood her pain because he had lived his own. That night, as she settled into her bed of furs with Harold sleeping at her side, Freya looked toward where Ragnar stood guard at the cave entrance. The warrior's silhouette outlined against the stars seemed to her the very image of strength and protection. For the first time since being expelled from her home, she allowed herself to think about the future with something resembling hope. The days in the cave turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Freya had completely recovered her strength, and Harold was growing healthy and strong under the care of both. Life had taken on a calm and natural rhythm that neither had experienced before. Each dawn brought new lessons in each other's language. Each sunset brought new stories shared by the fire. Ragnar taught Freya the secrets of the wilderness, showed her which plants were edible and which medicinal, how to find water following the signs left by animals, how to read the stars to orient oneself during the night. Freya discovered she had a natural ability for these teachings, as if something inside her had been waiting to awaken all her life. In exchange, Freya taught Ragnar the stories and songs of her people, told him about Norwegian festivals, about the music she had heard in the village squares of her childhood, about the dishes the estate cooks prepared. Ragnar listened with fascination, his eyes shining with curiosity about a world so different from his but equally rich in traditions. One night of a full moon, when Harold slept deeply in his small cradle made of reeds, Freya and Ragnar sat closer than usual by the fire. They had been talking about the stars, he pointing out the constellations his people used to navigate, when their hands accidentally touched. The contact was like an electric spark that paralyzed them both. Ragnar slowly withdrew his hand but didn't look away from hers. In his dark eyes, Freya saw something that made her tremble, desire, tenderness, and something deeper she didn't dare name. It was the first time a man looked at her that way, with respect, but also with hunger, as if she were beautiful and desirable. "Freya," Ragnar murmured, pronouncing her name with a softness that made her heart race. It was the first time she heard her name on his lips, and it sounded like a caress. Without words, he extended his hand toward her, offering her the possibility to take his or reject it. Freya looked at that extended hand for seconds that seemed eternal. She knew that if she took it, she would be crossing a line that would change everything between them. But she also knew that during these months she had come to love this silent man who had saved her life and her son's, who had given them shelter and protection when no one else in the world had offered it. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Ragnar's fingers closed gently around hers, and both felt the deep connection that had been growing between them during all these days of coexistence. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment without knowing it, as if everything that had happened before had been only preparation for this instant. Ragnar approached slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Freya didn't move, her eyes fixed on his, seeing in them all the gentleness and love he had been demonstrating to her with actions for months. When their lips finally met, it was with a tenderness that made her cry. The kiss was soft, reverent, full of all the feelings they had not been able to express with words. It was not just desire, but recognition, gratitude, true love that had grown slowly like a desert plant that blooms only when it finds perfect conditions. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. In the days that followed, their relationship gradually transformed. Gestures became more intimate, looks deeper, smiles more frequent. Ragnar began to bring her small gifts from the wilderness, rare flowers that bloomed only once a year, stones polished by wind that shone like jewels, colorful feathers he had found on his hunts. One afternoon, Ragnar disappeared for several hours and returned with something wrapped in a soft fur. With silent ceremony, he unwrapped the object before Freya. It was a necklace made of amber beads and sacred feathers, created according to the traditions of his people. With gestures that clearly indicated the importance of the moment, he offered it to her. Freya immediately understood the meaning. In Viking culture, this type of gift was equivalent to a marriage proposal. Ragnar was asking her to become his wife according to the traditions of his people. Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded, and he placed the necklace around her neck with hands that trembled slightly. That night, they celebrated their union under the stars with a simple but deeply significant ceremony that Ragnar explained to her step by step. They exchanged promises in their respective languages, offered prayers to their ancestors, and committed to protect each other until the end of their days. Harold, now an active baby who crawled all over the cave, was included in the ceremony as a symbol of the family they were forming. The months that followed were the happiest of Freya's life. She had found not just a husband who loved her, but a companion who respected her strength and valued her intelligence. Ragnar taught her the survival skills she needed to live as a Viking, while she contributed knowledge that enriched both their lives. It was during this period of happiness that Freya discovered she was pregnant again. The announcement filled Ragnar with a joy that completely transformed his usually serious face. He danced around the cave like a child, lifted Harold onto his shoulders, and that night prepared a special dinner to celebrate the news. But their happiness was interrupted when worrying signs appeared on the horizon: smoke from distant fires, horse tracks near their refuge, and rumors that reached them through other Vikings about Norwegian soldiers searching for a kidnapped woman. It was evident that Freya's family had not abandoned the search and had convinced the authorities that she was a victim needing rescue. Ragnar made the decision that they should move deeper into Viking territory, where his clan could protect them better. It was a difficult decision because it meant abandoning the refuge that had become their home, but both knew that the safety of their growing family was more important than any sentimental attachment. The last night in the cave, Freya stayed awake for a long time, looking at the paintings on the walls that had been silent witnesses to her transformation from desperate woman to loved wife and protective mother. The next day would begin a new stage of her life, more challenging but also full of possibilities. While Ragnar slept at her side and Harald rested in his small cradle, Freya placed her hand on her belly where new life was growing. This child would be born free, would grow knowing the love of both parents, and would be raised in a culture that valued the strength of spirit as much as that of body. It was a hope worth any sacrifice. 5 years had passed since that desperate night in the wilderness when Freya believed she would die alone and abandoned. Now, in her new home among the mountains of Viking territory, she had become a woman respected and loved by the entire clan. Her second child, a beautiful daughter named Astrid after her mother, but with a completely different destiny, had been born with her father's eyes and ran through the camp alongside Harald, both speaking fluently, both Norwegian and Old Norse. Freya had found her place as the clan's healer, combining the medicinal knowledge she had learned in her youth with the ancestral teachings that Ragnar and the elders had transmitted to her. Her fame as a healer had spread even to neighboring Norwegian communities, where they called her the Medicine Woman, and they came seeking her when the doctors from the towns could not cure their sick. One morning, while Freya was preparing medicinal herbs in her home, a Viking rider arrived at full gallop bringing news that would change everything again. Jarl Bjorn, the Iron-Fisted, her father, was gravely ill and had sent his son Thorvald to find her. The man who had expelled her from his house 5 years ago now desperately needed her. Thorvald had arrived alone, without soldiers or threats, only with a letter from his father written with a trembling hand. In it, Jarl Bjorn confessed that he had committed the greatest mistake of his life by expelling his daughter, and that now, facing death, he only wished to see her once more to ask her forgiveness. Ragnar observed his wife read the letter, seeing the emotions that crossed her face. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with tears, but also with a deep peace she had learned to cultivate during these years of happiness. "What do you want to do?" Ragnar asked her softly, respecting as always her right to make her own decisions. "I want to go," Freya responded without hesitation. "Not for him, but for me. I want to close that wound forever." The journey back to the family estate was like a strange dream for Freya. Now she rode like a true woman of the wilderness, strong and secure, accompanied by her warrior husband and her 2 beautiful children. Thorvald watched them with amazement, seeing how his sister had transformed into someone completely different from the timid young woman he remembered. When they arrived at the longhouse, Freya felt a mixture of nostalgia and detachment. The walls that had once been her prison now seemed small and suffocating compared to the freedom of the wilderness she had known. Jarl Bjorn waited for her in his bed, converted into a shadow of the powerful man he had been. When he saw his daughter enter, accompanied by her Viking family, his eyes filled with tears of regret. "My daughter," he murmured with a broken voice. "Can you forgive a foolish old man who didn't know how to value the treasure he had?" Freya approached the bed and took her father's hand. "I forgave you long ago, father," she said softly. "Holding resentment would have poisoned my heart, and my family deserves a mother full of love, not bitterness." During the days that followed, Jarl Bjorn met his grandchildren and marveled at his daughter's wisdom and strength. He saw how Ragnar treated her with respect and admiration, how her children adored her, and how she radiated a genuine happiness she had never possessed in her youth. Before dying, Jarl Bjorn did something that surprised everyone. He bequeathed all his lands to Freya, publicly recognizing that she had found true wealth in love and family. But Freya made a decision that demonstrated her wisdom. She divided the lands among the needy families of the region, keeping only a small portion where she would establish a clinic to serve both Norwegians and Vikings. Freya's clinic became a symbol of hope and reconciliation. There, Norwegians and Vikings worked together healing the sick without caring about their origin. Her children grew up seeing that differences between cultures could be bridges instead of barriers, and that true love transcends any frontier. Years later, when Freya's hair began to silver and Ragnar developed new wrinkles around his eyes from so many smiles, they sat together on the porch of their home watching their grandchildren play. Harold had become a strong young man who spoke several languages and served as interpreter between the communities, while Astrid showed the same gift for healing as her mother. "Do you regret anything?" Ragnar asked her one afternoon, as he had done so many times over the years. Freya smiled, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I regret taking so long to find you," she responded, taking his weathered hand in hers. In the distance, the mountains rose majestically under the infinite sky, guarding the secrets of a woman who had transformed abandonment into love, desperation into hope, and rejection into the foundation of a family that had become legend on both sides of the cultural frontier. The story of Freya and Ragnar was told around fires, inspiring others to believe that true love can flourish in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst tragedies. The abandoned mother who gave birth alone in the frozen wilderness had become the bridge between two worlds, proving that compassion knows no borders, that family is chosen not by blood but by love, and that from the deepest darkness can emerge the most brilliant light. And when the northern lights danced in the winter sky, the people of both clans would look up and remember the woman who had been cast out to die, but instead had built a legacy of healing, unity, and hope that would endure for generations. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fascinating stories about history's greatest figures and events.